So the birds, when they hear that, no, they start to move. Then you see, Hornbill. These are rhino. So each species has a very distinctive call. Rhinoceros.
What was it?
We follow the trails of the sound of a helmeted hornbill and a rhino hornbill and onto the forest tracks.
Oh. Oh, they were flying.
While we're at it, a quick history lesson from Oi on the Digiscope.
Discoping actually is a technique whereby you put an instant camera behind a field scope, spotting scope, big scope. So you can see by the eye through the scope, normally 20x, 20 times the 60x. And if you can see in your eyesight through the scope, why can't you put a camera and shoot the images? That's where it started, discoping. The invention was started by Lawrence Paul of Ipoh, who said, if I can see through the scope, why can't I take a picture? So he put his, I think at that time, Pentax small camera in the medic and poke inside the eyepiece of the scope and then take a picture. He was shooting an eagle at the time in Royal Perak Golf Club. Yeah. So he was looking at the say, if I can see the eagle, why can't I shoot it? So that's how he discovered, hey, it can be done. The images come out, of course, shake a bit lah. So later on, what we do, we put an adapter in between the camera and the field scope, the spotting scope. At that time, there's no name given to it. So when the picture was posted internationally to the world in first website in November 1999, there was the first website which is still around. It's called birdwatchers@yahoo.com, and one of the Belgian birders coined the technique as digiscoping, digital camera plus scope. So digiscoping, that's how it started.
So
it's not copyright. You would have copyrighted, then Lawrence would make a lot of money, but he didn't. So digiscoping eventually becomes so common term that everybody accepted it. Oh, that is a technique used, spotting scope attached with a small camera. So that is where it starts. The advantage of digiscoping is because the eyepiece, the magnification. For example, binoculars, you start 8 to 10x, 10 times, 8 to 10 times. Whereas scope normally comes with 20 times to 60 times. So you can see the bird much further away and as very big. So you can take a full frame. For example, our camera here is only reaching 600 mm or 300 mm, whereas that one will reach 1000 over 2000 mm. The digiscoping with the camera itself that normally carries a crop factor of 2x or 3x plus 20x, for example, is already 60x. Yeah, so 60x is probably equivalent to 1000 over millimeters in our normal lens. So you can take a picture full frame with digiscoping technique. Right? So the advantage is you can take long distance object very close to you. So this is the advantage of using digiscoping.
We are not prepared for the disappointment that awaits us. While you were in, they flew out. What? Yeah, both the helmeted hornbill and rhino, the cameraman and boatman inform us they only had time to stub out their scenes. Apparently birds are better than humans in the art of tricking. But that did not stop us from posing for some pictures at Sungai Papan. But soon the sight of greyfish eagle cheers us up, and so does the thought of our lunch, and perversely the thought of some bird watchers spending hours to take a shot of the hornbill cheers us further.
Experiences of actually finding hornbills, trying to have a peek into their secret lives has been, I would say, challenging but rewarding. But it has not been smooth in my experience of finding hornbills. It was tough in the beginning. When you start something new, it's extremely difficult. And we try to take inspiration from the hornbill expert in Thailand. Her name is Professor Dr. Pillai Punswat. She is one of the 2 global hornbill experts in the world. So based on her experiences, which she has noted down in books, in manuals, so we learned from that, we read, and then we tried it in the field in Belum. But we also found that what works in Thailand may not necessarily work 100% or as well in Malaysia. So we had to improvise a bit. One of the things that we learned is that in Thailand, one of the methods of actually looking for hornbills is to find a higher ground, like a cliff or a hill, which gives you a vantage point of the landscape. So from there, from that position, then you can see if the hornbills flying left or right, or left or right. That might indicate something is ongoing. If it's in the breeding season, there could be a nest somewhere. The question is now, where do you go, left or right? But the fact is that gives you an idea of which direction to go when you leave the cliff. Now in Belum finding a high ground is actually tough. In the early years, we tried some of the logging roads within Temenggo, but success was pretty much slim. It was very hard, number one, to find a higher ground, and number two, sometimes when you find a higher ground, it's still covered in trees. So you can't go ahead and chop down the trees to get a better view. So we can't do that. Because Belum has a lake. We take a boat and we use that forest valley like a road, if you want. And from there, we can observe, we would have a view of slopes, left and right. So we take a boat and then we slowly park ourselves and then wait for a certain period of time, observe left and right to see if there are hornbill behavior or their hornbill activities that we can further investigate. And with that method, we are slightly more successful. Eating hornbills, especially when they are breeding, finding the tree in the next step is obviously very, even more difficult than finding hornbills. So we have help from our Orang Asli field assistants. So they're obviously more at home in the forest and more attuned. So they help us to locate some of the trees. Now upon locating the trees, what we do next is to try to observe their behavior while they are nesting. Hornbills are pretty unique in the sense that in their breeding season, the female will imprison herself inside the tree. So they will enter a hole in a tree and then they will seal it up. So that leaves a small slit that allows food to go in and debris to come out. While the male will have the glorious duty for the next 3 months, or some goes as long as 8 months, to feed, to make sure that mom and baby or babies are well fed until they're all ready to leave. That gives you. Now, in order to do that, we have to at least have a view, of that tree and whatever activity goes on. So we have to construct a hide, and you have to sit there, and you have to be very, very quiet. Because the moment the male hornbill, upon return, or have a sense of something is not right around my nest, probably it will not return for several hours, and you will probably be sitting there watching nothing.
We continue the trail with the rest of expedition members to Sungai Rambutan. We see a lesser fish eagle fish bird perched on a broken branch and learn a thing or two from how some scientists discover through birds that what is bad for them is bad for human beings.
Like, for example, agriculture, you spray those chemicals. Yes. Used to be 30 years, 40 years ago, a very famous one, developed by Russia. It was very good for agriculture. You wanted to destroy all the weeds. The first thing that came out on those very effective, to kill all the weeds, what do you call it, is by Russian. And they use it a lot in America, in many in the country, because it was very good. But there's one colony of eagles in one area where birders have been observing how many chicks, how many eagle chick has been coming out. But subsequently asking why. So these chicks, this eagle goes to paddy field, all these wheat fields to cari makan. So what they do is they study the nest, study the eggs, and find that the eggshell is very thin now. Because the raptors eat the rats in the rice field or whatever in the rice field, and the rice field contain of this chemical. So it weakens the egg shell, so the chicks cannot be born. So from then on they ban, because if it's affecting the eagle, it will affect human beings. It was proven that it will affect our genes. So it was taken off from the world. So the birds give us the survival instinct. I mean, they are the victim or sacrifice to let human being the poison there.
The engine is switched off and we strain and train our ears to the sounds of the teeming lives in the forest. The expedition is limited mostly to the lake, so there is no other trip into the deep forest in this expedition. It is a bit disappointing, but we are informed that another team had sighted some otters and the trails of elephants on the other end of the lake. We head there fast, passing one of the few chalet grounds in the lake area. We have come closer to the northern part of the forest park, which brought us the view of a mountain. The other side of the mountain is Thailand, we're informed. The entire expedition members are here checking on the trails of the elephants and otters left on shore. 3 hornbills had been spotted way up near the tolling trees, but nobody could really tell at the distance they were flying exactly what species of hornbills they were.
Terminal tail band is called. That means that at the end of the tail, there's a white thing. But this guy has also a little bit of a protrusion from the, a black, protrusion which is not in the book.
Were they the great hornbills or black hornbills? It was a short-lived debate. They were 3 wreathed hornbills. So we seemed to have finally got our visual treat of not 1 but 3 hornbills. It is the final day and the bird watchers gather on the upper deck of the boathouse to exchange notes. Avid bird watcher Carol obliges the group with the sound of a bird's call.
It goes
Yeah. And they are also getting
At the prize-giving ceremony for the best bird-watching team, Perak State Executive Councillor Nuraini promises an international bird expedition. She also promises to do her best to ensure that the area is kept close to its natural state and any ecotourism activity will be in line with conservation plans for the park, which brings us to the topic of conservation.
As a forest landscape area, Royal Belum and Temuco Forest Reserves, because they have all those beautiful trees growing, they are a natural carbon sink. They take in the carbon from the air, the plants, the trees and so on. So having a carbon sink or a carbon machine that takes in all this carbon, having that in our country is actually a really good thing. It is something that we should be proud of, that we still have big areas of forest. The thing is, we must maintain and keep it as it is. The more areas we protect, the more the trees can actually help us survive more, healthier and so on. Not just climate change, it's everything else. Over 70% of medicines that we use today, they come from the trees and plants and forests. What else can we use from the forest that will benefit human in the long term is something that we have to research into and investigate. But the problem now is we seem to be clearing forests even before we learn about how it helps us or how we can actually gain from it in the long term. So Royal Belum's State Park, beautiful, it's protected. Temuco needs to be protected too, because together in one big forest complex, they can do a lot more for mankind. This forest complex will also help the government actually, because we have international obligations that we must try to cut down our CO2, our greenhouse gas emissions. By having this big vast forest that actually absorbs carbon, it's possibly easily to quantify how much a 300,000 hectare of forest can absorb in a year, for example, CO2. So having a forest actually helps Malaysia deal with our international obligation as a global community. It will help us because the trees are working for us. It helps Malaysia as a landscape and as an ecosystem. It gives a service, an invaluable service to mankind, locally or in the region. The forests regulate water supply for us. And we use this water supply right now to harness the energy for electricity. We use the water now to pipe also to homes. People use it for agriculture and so on. So having a rainforest intact, having the Royal Belum State Park and the Temuco Forest Reserve intact and preserved, not only will we also address other issues like climate change, for example. If you do not have the forest in that area, there's going to be a lot of difference you see in terms of localized climate. We'll probably be seeing a lot less water, a lot more waterborne diseases, for example, malaria. We'll also see the change in terms of the flowering season. And the flowering season in the forest affects everything. The feeding habits of the birds and wildlife, from the bees and when they make their honey and so on, to the butterflies that come out and feeding and surviving. So climate change will not only affect wildlife and flower and fruit propagation for the whole area around it, it also will affect humans in terms of forest services, in terms of water and air and so on. And now, if Malaysia is serious about helping or supporting the climate change agenda, the more forests we have is an asset for us as a country. Because the countries around the world who have forests, most of them are trying to protect the forests that they have because it absorbs, it is a sink, it absorbs all these harmful greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide, for example, it takes it in. So it actually helps us. It helps Malaysians, it helps the locals who live around it, and it helps us as a global community.
The whole landscape is very large and which is very good in this case, because it can allow the hornbill to live up its potential and its role. So we would like, hopefully, to see Belum Temenggong manage as best as possible, as sustainably as possible, to allow the hornbill populations to continue to flourish and to play its role, natural role in this case. Birds is, everything is interconnected in an ecosystem. It is linked together. Now, in order for forests to remain healthy, right, it requires different actors. In this case, it can be the smallest bug or a bacteria to the largest organism, birds, tigers, elephants. So each of them have an interconnected relationship, and each of them have a role to play. And as I mentioned just now, one of the roles that is playing within an ecosystem is that role of a hornbill and the fruit tree. The fruit tree perhaps uses hornbills as one of those dispersing agents to help it disperse. Because too many trees of the same within the small area is also not good for that particular tree, because it creates competition. So what it does is it wants to spread its progeny to other areas to maintain itself to be healthy, and also to make sure that other parts of the forest remain healthy as well. So every single organism in a forest, from the smallest to the largest, have a role to play, which affects the non-living environment within that forest. If you have a healthy forest, you would also have a healthy ecosystem. Also as well, you have clean water, you have oxygen, you have also various services that the forest will provide. It's just that perhaps sometimes men don't fully understand those roles that they play. We can understand what hornbills